What if I told you that some of the most important chapters of American history were never lost, only hidden? That entire black communities were erased not by time, but by choice. That progress you were taught was inevitable was actually resisted at every step. This is not a story about the past being over. This is a story about why the present looks the way it does. Stay with me, because once you hear what was deliberately left out, you will never see America the same way again. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. There are moments in a nation's life when silence is not accidental. It is engineered. When facts are buried, when names are forgotten, when courage is mislabeled as disorder, history itself becomes a battleground. And in the United States, one of the longest and quietest battles has been over black history. What is remembered, what is erased, and what we are allowed to call truth. America tells a comforting story about itself, a story of steady progress, of freedom widening over time, of a nation that corrects its mistakes simply because it is destined to. But history, when listened to closely, speaks in a more complicated voice. It tells us that progress was never inevitable. It was demanded, often by black Americans whose resistance frightened those in power enough to make them want those stories gone. Consider the end of the Civil War. Freedom had been declared, but freedom had not yet been defended. During Reconstruction, black men were elected to Congress. Black communities built schools, church, newspapers, and businesses from the ashes of slavery. For a brief, fragile moment, democracy expanded. And then the federal government retreated. Troops were withdrawn. White supremacist terror groups were tolerated. The promise of Reconstruction was abandoned in exchange for political convenience. That retreat was not a footnote. It was a choice. And its consequences shaped a century. What followed was not simply segregation, but a deliberate rewriting of reality. Textbooks praised the Confederacy. Monuments rose to men who fought to preserve human bondage. Meanwhile, massacres went unnamed. Resistance went unrecorded. Black achievement was treated as anomaly rather than evidence. Take Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. A democratically elected multiracial government was overthrown. WN by white mobs. Black citizens were murdered. Black leaders were expelled from the city. Newspapers of the time called it a race riot, implying chaos rather than coup. For decades, the truth was missing from classrooms. The language itself was a tool of erasure. Or Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Greenwood was known as Black Wall Street, a thriving center of black wealth and independence. Over the course of 2 days, it was burned to the ground. Airplanes dropped firebombs. Hundreds were killed. Survivors were silenced. Insurance claims were denied. And for nearly a century, the massacre was absent from official state history, not because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. The pattern repeats. When black Americans organized for labor rights, they were labeled radicals. When the Y demanded equal protection under the law, they were called agitators. When they defended themselves, they were criminalized. COINTELPRO, a secret FBI program, infiltrated black organizations, spread disinformation, and destroyed lives, all in the name of national security. The goal was not only to stop movements, but to ensure future generations would never fully understand them. Yet erasure never fully succeeds. Memory lives in families, in churches, in whispered stories passed down because the official record refused to carry them. It lives in names scratched into headstones, in photographs tucked away, in songs that carried truth when public speech was dangerous. And here is the deeper lesson history offers us. The fight has never been only over laws or elections. It has been over narrative, over who belongs in the American story and under what terms. Power understands something essential, that controlling the past shapes the future. But history is patient. It waits. And when it resurfaces, it asks something of us. It asks whether we are brave enough to look without flinching, whether we can accept that patriotism is not the absence of criticism, but the presence of moral responsibility, whether we can honor black history not as a separate chapter, but as central to the American experiment itself. Because black history is not marginal. It is foundational. The struggle for freedom refined the meaning of freedom. The demand for equality clarified the Constitution's promise. Every expansion of democracy in this country has been shaped, pressed, and often paid for by black Americans whose names were too often left out. The truth is this: history was not erased because it lacked importance. It was erased because it had power. Power to challenge myths, power to expose choices, power to remind us that America is not great by default, but by decision. And now the question rests with us. Will we continue the silence, or will we tell the fuller story, honestly, ageously, and with the humility to learn from it? Erasure as a tool of power is not loud. It does not announce itself with proclamations or marching drums. It works quietly, through omission, through distortion, through the careful shaping of what is deemed worthy of remembrance. In American history, erasure has often been more effective than chains, more enduring than laws, because it operates on the mind. If people do not know what was taken from them, they cannot easily demand its return. If a nation forgets who suffered and who benefited, it can convince itself that injustice was accidental rather than designed. From the very beginning, power in America understood the value of controlling the story. Enslaved Africans were not simply forced into labor, they were stripped of language, lineage, and recorded identity. Names were replaced, birthdays were erased, families were separated without documentation. This was not only cruelty, it was strategy. A people without a written past could be presented as a people without a meaningful one. When history began at the moment of enslavement, everything before it vanished, and with it vanished claims to humanity, culture, and dignity. After emancipation, the threat shifted. Black Americans were no longer property, but they were still dangerous to the established order because they remembered. They remembered stolen labor, broken families, denied education, and unpunished violence. That memory, if widely acknowledged, challenged the moral legitimacy of those in power, and so the work of erasure adapted. It moved from plantations to textbooks, from overseers to institutions. The period after the Civil War exposed this clearly. Reconstruction offered a vision of a multiracial democracy that terrified those who had long equated power with whiteness. Black men voted, governed, debated, and legislated. Schools flourished, communities organized. This reality could not be allowed to stand unchallenged in the national memory. But on Reconstruction was violently dismantled. The violence itself was reframed. White supremacist terror was described as restoration. Federal abandonment was described as reconciliation. The story shifted from one of betrayed justice to one of misunderstood excess. Language became the first instrument of erasure. Massacres were renamed riots. Coups were called elections corrected. Resistance was abled criminality. When words change, meaning follows. When meaning shifts, responsibility fades. This linguistic sleight of hand allowed the nation to distance itself from its own actions without denying them outright. It was not that violence did not occur, it was that its purpose was obscured. Erasure also depended on what was elevated. Monuments rose to Confederate leaders not immediately AF. The war, but decades later, during moments when black political power threatened the status quo, these statues were not about honoring history, they were about shaping it. They taught generations who was worthy of reverence and who was not. At the same time, black heroes were confined to footnotes or removed entirely. The absence was instructive. It taught silence as surely as statues taught loyalty. Education systems played a central role. What children learn shapes the boundaries of their moral imagination. By excluding black suffering and black resistance, curricula presented inequality as natural, even inevitable. Slavery became an unfortunate chapter rather than the economic foundation of a nation. Jim Crow became a regional quirk rather than a national system. The federal government's role in enforcing or tolerating these systems was softened or ignored. In this way, erasure did not deny injustice, it minimized it until it no longer demanded response. This process required participation from respected institutions. Universities, publishers, historical societies, and media outlets all contributed, sometimes knowingly, sometimes passively. Silence often masqueraded as neutrality. To omit was easier than to confront. To simplify was safer than to tell the full story. And so a partial truth became the accepted one. Erasure was also enforced through fear. Those who attempted to preserve memory faced consequences. Journalists who reported too honestly risked their lives. Black veterans who returned from war demanding the rights they fought for were punished. Activists who documented abuses were surveilled, harassed, and discredited. When the state labels memory as subversion, forgetting becomes an act of self-preservation. The power of erasure lies in its cumulative effect. One forgotten event can be dismissed. Hundreds create a pattern. When massacres like Colfax, Elaine, Rosewood, and Tulsa were excluded from official histories, it was not coincidence. It was consistency. Each omission reinforced the idea that black suffering was either exaggerated or irrelevant. Over time, this shaped public perception so thoroughly that demands for justice appeared unreasonable, even threatening. Erasure also distorted white identity. By removing evidence of systemic wrongdoing, it allowed a comforting narrative of innocence to flourish. If injustice was rare or accidental, then there was no need for accountability. This false innocence became fiercely protected because to acknowledge erasure would mean acknowledging benefit. Power does not easily surrender the myths that justify it. Even in the modern era, erasure persists in subtler forms. Surveillance programs are classified, records are sealed, archives are underfunded, debates over what can be TOG. HT are framed as protecting children rather than protecting power. The argument is no longer that history did not happen, but that it should not be emphasized, that remembering too much is divisive, that silence is unity, yet erasure is never complete. It leaves traces. Gaps in the record raise questions. Inconsistencies demand explanation. Oral histories survive where official documents fail. Memory adapts. It finds new vessels. Each generation rediscovers what the last was told to forget. And in that rediscovery lies both discomfort and possibility. To understand erasure as a tool of power is to recognize that forgetting is not passive. It is taught. It is enforced. It is rewarded. And remembering in such a system becomes an act that unsettles order. It threatens the carefully constructed balance between myth and reality, between comfort and truth, between power and accountability, and that threat is precisely why erasure has been used so deliberately, so persistently, and with such devastating effectiveness across the American story, shaping not only what is remembered, but who is believed, who is mourned, who is honored, and whose pain is allowed to matter at Alakaz. The past is not dead. It is watching. And what we choose to remember will decide who we bear. Reconstruction's broken promise began with a moment of extraordinary possibility. The Civil War had ended not only a system of forced labor, but an entire way of defining human worth. 4 million people emerged from bondage carrying hope that freedom would finally mean protection, opportunity, and belonging. The nation stood at a crossroads, faced with a fundamental question: would liberty be extended as a principle or rationed as a privilege? In the years immediately following the war, the federal government seemed to choose the bolder path. Constitutional amendments abolished slavery, defined citizenship, and promised equal protection under the law. Federal troops occupied the former Confederate state, not as conquerors, but as guardians of a fragile peace. For the first time in American history, black men voted in large numbers. They served on juries, they held local offices, they entered state legislatures and the halls of Congress itself. Democracy, long restricted, briefly expanded. This period unsettled long-standing assumptions about power. Formerly enslaved people did not simply seek survival, they sought participation. They built schools with their own hands and money, understanding that education was the key to permanence. Churches became centers of political organization and mutual aid. Newspapers carried black voices across counties and states, creating a public sphere that had never before existed for them. These were not marginal developments. They represented a profound challenge to a racial hierarchy that had defined American life for generations. That challenge provoked a fierce response. White supremacist violence erupted almost immediately, not as spontaneous backlash, but as organized resistance. Paramilitary groups formed with clear political goals: suppress the black vote, intimidate black leaders, and restore white control. Murders, beatings, and arson were widespread. Entire communities were terrorized into silence. This violence was not hidden from federal authorities. Reports were written, testimonies were collected, the danger was known. For a time, the federal government acted. Enforcement acts were passed, troops intervened, federal courts prosecuted those who sought to overthrow lawful governments through terror. These actions demonstrate that Reconstruction could have succeeded if sustained. But commitment faltered. Political will weakened. Northern fatigue set in. The moral urgency that had driven emancipation gave way to calculations of expedience. Economic interests played a decisive role. Industrial growth in the North depended increasingly on reconciliation with Southern elites. Stability mattered more than justice. The lie, BES, and rights of black citizens became bargaining chips in a larger political negotiation. The contested election of 1876 crystallized this shift. In exchange for political power, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction, already under assault, was effectively abandoned. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without federal protection, black communities were left exposed. Violence surged. State governments moved swiftly to dismantle Reconstruction-era reforms. Voting rights were stripped away through intimidation, fraud, and later through law. Segregation hardened. Courts turned away from enforcement of equal protection. The promise of the Constitution was hollowed out by those entrusted to uphold it. What made this betrayal particularly cruel was the clar, idiot of the choice. The nation did not lack knowledge, it lacked resolve. Leaders understood that withdrawal would lead to repression. They accepted that outcome as the price of political unity. Black Americans were told implicitly and explicitly that their rights were negotiable, their safety expendable, their citizenship conditional. This retreat reshaped American democracy by allowing terror. To succeed, the federal government set a precedent that violence could determine political outcomes. White supremacist rule in the South was not an accident of history, it was the result of policy decisions. Jim Crow did not emerge from nowhere. It grew in the vacuum left by federal abandonment. The broken promise of Reconstruction also altered the national memory. Rather than acknowledging FALU, the ERA was recast as a mistake. Black political participation was portrayed as incompetence. Corruption was exaggerated, while white supremacist violence was minimized or ignored. This narrative absolved those who withdrew support and shifted blame onto the very people who had been betrayed. Generations grew up learning a distorted version of Reconstruction, one that justified its end rather than mourning its collapse. This distortion reinforced the idea that black self-governance was inherently unstable, that equality was impractical, that progress required restraint. These myths hardened into assumptions, shaping policy and public opinion well into the 20th century. The human cost of this abandonment is difficult to measure fully. Families who had briefly tasted political power watched it vanish. Children educated in Reconstruction schools saw opportunities close. Communities that had organized openly were forced underground. The psychological toll of hope raised and then crushed echoed across generations. Yet even in defeat, Reconstruction left an enduring legacy. The constitutional amendments remained dormant but intact. The memory of participation survived in store. ES passed down. The idea that democracy could be multiracial did not disappear, it was postponed. Each later movement for civil rights drew upon that earlier moment, not as nostalgia, but as proof that another America had once existed. The tragedy of Reconstruction is not only that it failed, but that it was allowed to fail despite evidence that success was possible. It revealed the limits of moral commitment when confronted with entrenched power. It exposed the fragility of rights without enforcement. It demonstrated that freedom declared is not the same as freedom defended. Reconstruction's broken promise continues to shape the present. Voter suppression, racial violence, and unequal protection under the law are not anomalies, they are inheritances. The decisions made in the late 19th century established patterns that still echo. To understand those patterns is to confront the reality that progress can be reversed when vigilance fades, that democracy requires not just ideals, but endurance, and that the cost of abandonment is carried longest by those who were promised the most and given the least. Silenced massacres and stolen narratives occupy a dark and deliberate space in American history, where violence was not only inflicted but carefully hidden. These were not moments lost to time by accident. They were pushed into the shadows by design, their memory buried because acknowledging them would expose the gap between American ideals and American actions. The silence that followed these massacres became almost as powerful as the violence itself, shaping Janer. Asians who grew up unaware that entire communities had been destroyed in plain sight. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, racial violence was widespread, often public, and frequently sanctioned by local authorities. Black towns were attacked, black neighborhoods burned, black families driven from land they owned. These were not spontaneous eruptions of anger, but coordinated acts meant to enforce racial order. When black success threatened existing hierarchies, violence followed. And when violence succeeded, it was explained away, reframed, or erased. The massacre in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873 revealed how early this pattern took hold. After a disputed election during Reconstruction, white militias attacked black citizens defending a courthouse. Dozens were killed, many after surrendering. The event was reported, investigated, and even reached the Supreme Court. Yet the legal outcome stripped federal protections from black citizens, signaling that the state would not intervene decisively against racial terror. Over time, Colfax faded from public memory, not because it lacked significance, but because its implications were too unsettling. As the decades passed, the pattern repeated with chilling consistency. In Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, a multiracial Democratic government was violently overthrown. Black-owned newspapers were destroyed. Black leaders were forced into exile. The city's black population was terrorized into submission. The event was celebrated by its perpetrators and justified in the press as necessary to restore order. Official his. Tories followed suit, portraying the massacre as a riot rather than a coup, a distortion that endured for nearly a century. Silence was reinforced through institutional power. Courts failed to prosecute perpetrators. Police either stood aside or participated. Insurance companies refused to compensate losses. Journalists softened language or avoided coverage altogether. Each institution played a role in ensuring that the violence would not demand accountability. Without records, without trials, without reparations, the massacres were reduced to rumors, then to myths, then to nothing at all. Tulsa in 1921 stands as one of the most devastating examples. Greenwood was a thriving black community, economically independent and socially cohesive. When violence erupted, it did so with remarkable coordination. Homes and businesses were looted and burned. Survivors were detained rather than protected. The destruction was so complete that maps were altered, property records erased, and survivors pressured into silence. For decades, the massacre was omitted from school curricula and public commemorations. Children grew up unaware that one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in America history had occurred in their state. The erasure of these massacres was not merely a local failure, it was national. Federal authorities rarely intervened, and when they did, their actions were limited. The absence of federal acknowledgement sent a clear message. Black lives lost to racial violence would not be honored, and black suffering would not be centered in the national narrative. This lens allowed the country to maintain a self-image of progress while ignoring the cost of that illusion. Language played a crucial role in this process. By labeling massacres as riots, blame was shifted onto victims. Chaos replaced intent. Mutual conflict replaced organized aggression. This framing absolved perpetrators and justified repression. It also discouraged empathy. If violence was porter, as disorder rather than destruction, there was no moral urgency to remember it. The stolen narratives extended beyond the events themselves to the lives that were erased. Black entrepreneurs, teachers, veterans, and families vanished from the historical record along with their communities. Their ambitions, achievements, and contributions were lost, leaving behind a distorted picture of black life as perpetually marginal rather than vibrantly present. This absence reinforced stereotypes and justified inequality by suggesting that black success was rare rather than systematically undermined. Memory survived in fragments. Survivors told stories in private, often warning their children to remain silent. Trauma shaped these narratives, making them cautious, incomplete, and fragile. Without institutional support, memory relied on personal courage. As survivors aged and passed away, the risk of total erasure grew. The rediscovery of these massacres in recent decades has revealed how deeply silence was enforced. Scholars uncovered hidden documents. Journalists tracked down survivors' descendants. Communities began to acknowledge what had been denied. These efforts were met with resistance, revealing that the struggle over memory was ongoing. Acknowledgement threatened established identities and challenged comfortable myths. The impact of silence massacres extends far beyond historical knowledge. It shapes trust in institutions. Communities that experienced violence without justice learned that the state could not be relied upon for protection. This distrust was rational, Pa. SS down through generations as lived experience rather than abstract theory. It influenced migration patterns, economic decisions, and political engagement. Stolen narratives also affect how the nation understands violence today. When historical massacres are unknown, contemporary racial violence appears isolated rather than part of a continuum. This fragmentation prevents collective reckoning. Each incident is treated as unprecedented, allowing patterns to persist unchallenged. The effort to reclaim these histories is not about reopening old wounds. It is about acknowledging that they never healed. Silence did not bring reconciliation. It brought amnesia, and amnesia allowed injustice to adapt and survive. To confront silenced massacres is to confront the reality that violence was foundational to maintaining racial hierarchy, not incidental to it. These stories demand more than recognition. They demand an honest accounting of how power operates when left unchecked. They reveal that democracy without memory is fragile, vulnerable to repetition of its worst moments. The refusal to remember is itself a form of violence, one that denies dignity to the dead and clarity to the living. And as long as these massacres remain marginal in the national consciousness, the narratives stolen from black communities continue to shape the present, influencing whose suffering is believed, whose loss is acknowledged, and whose history is considered worth telling. Criminalizing black resistance has been one of the most effective ways power has neutralized demands for justice in the United States. When oppression is named, it becomes vulnerable. When resistance is reframed as crime, it becomes punishable. This strategy allowed authorities to avoid confronting the substance of black grievances by shifting attention to the supposed threat posed by those who voiced them. The struggle was never simply against actions, but against legitimacy itself. From slavery onward, resistance by black people was treated not as a response to violence, but as violence itself. Enslaved PE. Opal who ran away were not described as seeking freedom. They were labeled thieves of their own bodies. Revolts were not framed as rebellions against brutality, but as evidence of inherent danger. Laws were written to codify this logic, making self-preservation a criminal act. In this framework, obedience was equated with morality and survival with guilt. After emancipation, this pattern adapted, rather than disappeared. Black codes criminalized everyday behavior, from loitering to unemployment, effectively re-enslaving thousands through convict leasing. Resistance to these systems, whether through protest or organization, was swiftly met with police action. Sheriffs, judges, and local officials enforced laws selectively, ensuring that black dissent could be legally suppressed while white violence went unpunished. The emergence of organized black political movements during Reconstruction intensified this dynamic. When black citizens voted, held office, or organized labor, they were accused of destabilizing society. Paramilitary groups portrayed themselves as protectors of order, while black political participation was framed as provocation. The state's failure to defend black CL sent a clear signal that resistance, even within the law, would be treated as illegitimate. As the 20th century unfolded, criminalization became more sophisticated. Law enforcement agencies expanded their reach, and legal language grew more complex, but the underlying logic remained the same. Black protest was surveilled, infiltrated, and disrupted. Peaceful demonstrations were met with arrests. Labor strikes led by black workers were broken through force. The law was not applied evenly. It was used strategically during the civil rights movement. This pattern was visible to the world. Children marching for desegregation were met with police dogs and fire hoses. Sit-ins were labeled trespassing. Boycotts were described as economic sabotage. Leaders were arrested on minor charge. To disrupt organizing efforts. The narrative presented to the public emphasized disorder rather than demand, law-breaking rather than injustice. This framing allowed resistance to be dismissed without addressing its cause. The federal government played a central role in this process. Surveillance programs targeted black leaders and organizations under the banner of national security. Files were compiled, rumors were spread, alliances were undermined. The goal was not simply to monitor, but to discredit. By portraying activists as extremists or criminals, authorities sought to isolate them from broader public support. This strategy extended beyond prominent figures to entire communities. Heavy policing in black neighborhoods normalized suspicion. Minor infractions were escalated into arrests. Incarceration rates rose dramatically, reinforcing stereotypes of criminality. These outcomes were then cited as justification for further policing, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Resistance to this cycle was itself framed as hostility toward law and order. Media coverage amplified these dynamics. Images of broken windows or confrontations dominated headlines, while the systemic unjust ICEs that prompted protests were relegated to background context. This selective focus shaped public perception, encouraging fear rather than understanding. When resistance was stripped of its moral context, it became easier to condemn. Criminalization also had a psychological effect. It forced black communities to weigh the cost of resistance, not only in physical danger, but in legal consequences. Organizing required extraordinary courage. Each protest carried the risk of arrest, surveillance, or worse. This pressure fragmented movements as some sought safety through accommodation while others pressed forward despite the risks. Despite these constraints, resistance persisted, adapting to the circumstances imposed upon it. Legal challenges were pursued. Cultural expression became a form of protest. Music, literature, and art carried messages that could not safely be spoken aloud, yet even these forms were scrutinized, censored, or dismissed as subversive, revealing how broadly criminalization could be applied. The legacy of criminalizing black resistance continues to shape contemporary debates. Protests against police violence are often judged by their compliance rather than their cause. The language of law and order resurfaces whenever demands for accountability grow louder. History is invoked selectively, praising past movements while condemning present ones, as if justice could be pursued without disruption. This contradiction reveals the enduring power of the strategy. By separating resistance from its historical context, criminalization makes injustice appear orderly and protest appear chaotic. It shifts responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. It asks whether protesters are behaving properly rather than whether society is behaving justly. Understanding this pattern requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how law functions in practice. Law is not inherently neutral. It reflects the priorities of those who enforce it. When resistance threatens existing hierarchies, legality becomes a weapon. Criminalization provides moral cover, allowing repression to be framed as protection rather than preservation of power. The cost of this strategy is profound. It erodes trust in institutions. It teaches generations that justice must be pursued quietly or not at all. It distorts the historical record, portraying black resistance as a problem, to managed rather than a conscience to be heard. And yet, even under these conditions, resistance has endured because the desire for dignity cannot be legislated away, and the impulse to challenge injustice persists even when the state defines that challenging memory, truth, and America's moral choice are inseparable, bound together in a quiet struggle over what kind of nation the United States leaves itself to be. Memory determines what is honored, what is ignored, and what is repeated. Truth determines whether that memory enlightens or deceives. And moral choice determines whether a society uses what it knows to grow or to hide. Throughout American history, black experience has stood at the center of this struggle, not because it is peripheral, but because it exposes the distance between. In the nation's ideals and its actions, memory is never neutral. It is shaped by institutions, by power, and by intention. What is remembered publicly often reflects what those in authority find acceptable. What is forgotten often reflects what they fear. For generations, America constructed a selective memory that emphasized triumph while muting trauma. The result was not ignorance, but imbalance. A nation taught to celebrate freedom without fully confronting who was denied it learned to see itself as virtuous by default. This imbalance carried consequences. When memory excludes suffering, truth becomes fragmented. The story of America becomes aspirational rather than accountable. Black history, when reduced to isolated moments of progress, is stripped of continuity. Struggle appears episodic rather than systemic. Resistance appears exceptional rather than necessary. This distortion comforts those who benefit from the status quo while isolating those who challenge it. Truth, when fully acknowledged, disrupts these comforts. It reveals that injustice was not an aberration but a pattern, that progress did not flow naturally from enlightenment but was extracted through pressure. The nation often changed not because it wished to, but because it was forced to confront its own contradictions. These truths are unsettling precisely because they demand responsibility. The resistance to truth is rarely framed as denial. More often, it is framed as fatigue, as a desire to move on, as a belief that the past has already been addressed. This framing suggests that memory has an expiration date. That pain, once acknowledged briefly, should be set aside. That continued remembrance is indulgent or divisive. In this way, calls for silence are presented as calls for unity. But unity built on selective memory is fragile. It asks those who were harmed to accept erasure as the price of belonging. It asks descendants of injustice to treat history as resolved when its effects are still present. This demand places the burden of reconciliation on those least responsible for the original harm, America's Mora. El choice emerges at this crossroads. It is the choice between comfort and clarity, between a version of history that reassures and one that instructs. Choosing clarity does not mean rejecting national ideals. It means taking them seriously. It means acknowledging that liberty and equality were aspirations long before they were realities, and that their realization required confrontation, sacrifice, and persistence. Moral choice is also revealed in whose voices are trusted. For much of American history, black testimony was doubted, dismissed, or criminalized. Lived experience was treated as bias rather than evidence. This skepticism was institutionalized, shaping courts, schools, and media. When truth is filtered through power, those without power must fight to be believed. The effort to reclaim memory challenges this hierarchy. When suppressed histories are recovered, they reframe the present. They explain patterns of inequality that cannot be understood through individual failure alone. They reveal how policy decisions echo across generations. They transform grievances into grievances with context and demands into demands with precedent. This reclamation is often met with resistance because it threatens identity. For some, acknowledging historical wrongdoing feels like personal accusation. This confusion between responsibility and guilt stalls moral progress. A mature nation distinguishes between inheriting history and being imprisoned by it. Acknowledgement is not condemnation, it is engagement. Truth also carries obligation. To know and do nothing is itself a choice. When history is clarified, neutrality becomes harder to justify. Silence becomes visible. The moral choice then shifts from whether injustice occurred to whether it will be addressed. This is where memory becomes active rather than archival. America has faced this choice before, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, in the Civil Rights era. Each time, moments of reckoning were followed by moments of retreat. Progress was made, then constrained. Rights were recognized, then undermined. These cycles were not accidents. They reflected unresolved tension between ideals and interests. The present moment is another iteration of this pattern. Debates over history, education, and public memory are not merely cultural disagreements. They are contests over moral direction, whether the nation will confront the full scope of its past or continue to manage it selectively, will shape its future as surely as any election or policy. Memory, when honest, expands empathy. It connects individuals to systems, moments to movements. It allows suffering to be seen not as isolated tragedy, but as shared responsibility. Truth, when embraced, sharpens judgment. It clarifies what must be changed rather than who must be blamed. America's moral choice is not abstract. It is reflected in whose histories are taught, whose pain is acknowledged, whose dignity is protected. It is revealed in whether remembrance leads to reform or simply to ritual, whether truth is used to repair or merely to debate. The struggle over black history is therefore not about the past alone. It is about whether the nation believes it can grow by telling the truth, or whether it must remain protected from it. It is about whether democracy is strong enough to withstand memory, and whether justice is valued enough to be informed by it. The answer to that question is written not only in speeches or laws, but in the stories a nation chooses to carry forward, the silences it refuses to maintain, and the courage it finds to face itself without illusion as a crime. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.